You as the parent are doing some risk analysis. And so there are probably most things that you would say, you know what, if he screws that up, it doesn't really matter. And he's probably going to learn a lot. You give them space. I'm going to let you figure out how to manage yourself. I'm not going to tell you your schedule. And if they don't do it, right, then they realize the consequences of that. Well, that's no big deal. That helps them. Failure helps them.
Hello, and welcome to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And today we are joined by Matthew McDill. He is a friend of Jonathan's. Apparently, he's roomed with Jonathan a little bit, so I'll let you give a little bit of an introduction to him.
Yeah, before we do that, longtime listeners, I want you to enjoy and take in this extra baritone and level of bass that David has. And yes, David is indeed not feeling the best, and yet, like a trooper, is hanging in here for a couple recordings this afternoon, which is kind of above and beyond the Call of Duty. So I just want to give him public credit here. So he's
I'm just
waking
running
up
off
right.
of prayers and Dayquil right now. Okay, that's the reality.
We edit out most of the parts where he's really delirious and kept the good ones that we can talk about later. So David, thanks for endurance. He's put in some hard work the last couple of days when he hasn't been feeling great, and that's never fun. Yeah, Dr. Matthew McDill, which I did know but had forgotten until we got a little bit into the conversation here, is a longtime friend. As I mentioned in the conversation, we met at some retreats, and we actually roomed together at one retreat pretty consistently. And he has a ton of experience. He has a ton of knowledge. And that is all tempered with some significant practical experience, both from a pastoral standpoint, as well as what he does now as an executive director for North Carolinians for home education. But he's also he's a husband and father of 9 children. And that doesn't give you a lot of practical experience. I don't know what will. And so it's somebody who has a lot of deep theoretical knowledge that has been, brought through the fires of practical reality. And what's left is some stuff that really works. And so this is a bit of a more pastoral conversation. Matthew brings in his background with his PhD in New Testament, as well as pastoral training, and then how that applies to how he parents and disciples his own children. And I've learned a lot from Matthew over the years, and it's fun to have this conversation and be able to share some of that knowledge with all of you. So hope you enjoy our conversation with Matthew. Matthew McDill, welcome to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm delighted to have you here. I know Matthew primarily as just a friend. We got to meet through a retreat that we started attending together. This is bad news for Matthew. It's been good news for me, but we wound up being kind of perennial roommates over the years for that. And then we've crossed paths at quite a few other conferences. We've had some other conversations, and we ought to do a better job of getting together outside of just these conferences and retreats, but we've had a really good time getting to know each other there. Because of that, I've just had this really interesting insight and perspective on Matthew's career, what he does, but also how he leads his family and the way he disciples those around him. And that was one of the primary reasons that I wanted him here on the podcast. Matthew is the father of 9, which is a pretty cool accomplishment, no matter how you look at it, and can speak from that, but also just from a really deep background academically, and then also just theologically in terms of his pastoral heart and background in terms of how we disciple and train young people. So, Matthew, it's really fun to have you on the podcast. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Jonathan. It's always a pleasure to talk and share ideas.
Well, Matthew, I gave a little bit of a really rough sketch of your background, but tell us a little bit about what you do now and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah. So I currently am executive director for North Carolinians for home education. That's been since 2019. For basically 25 years before that, I was in pastoral ministry in various capacities and finished a PhD in New Testament. And so one of the biggest things on my heart that has gone through pastoral ministry and even what I'm doing now is I just love helping people disciple other people. I love helping parents disciple other people. And so that's been a focus amongst just all the biblical teaching that I love to do. So I have 9 kids, and I do have a wife to go with them, and none of them are twins or anything, and they're all ours. those are just the questions I get,
Yeah,
you know.
those are the questions you get all the time. Well, Matthew, that combination, and I should say Dr. McDill, that combination of the academic background and the New Testament training, the pastoral training, the work that you do now as executive director of the state organization for homeschooling North Carolina for home educators, that's an interesting kind of theoretical and then practical blend. I mean, that's a place where you spend a lot of time in theory, and man, you really got to test that theory in multiple different ways and then add on to all that the very practical reality of discipling and parenting 9 children and being a husband to your wife. So, as I think about all those things together, give me your sort of practical definition of discipleship. Because when you say discipleship, I think of sort of super mentoring with a Christian twist to it, but there's something much deeper than that there. And I know we've had this conversation before. So talk to me a little bit about what you mean when you say discipling and discipleship.
So I think one important part of discipleship is that it happens within relationship. Obviously, there's trust, there's some kind of stability in walking out life together. And then the other part would be something that's pretty systematic. We want to know, what do we believe as Christians, but also how do we walk it out? How do we pray? How do we read the Bible? What does it look like to discern God's will, to operate in the body? And so you don't want to just assume, well, all these topics will come up one day. I think it's great to try to be intentional, try to walk through a lot of those topics, and of course they will come back up a lot. And so basically, is how do you help someone follow Jesus? And in the context of relationship and being very intentional about those topics.
So if I'd kind of boil that down, that I mean, you're defining it as it's an ongoing relationship, certainly, but a relationship that has both an I will go with you and that I will teach you what is happening, which is, in a lot of ways, the definition of parenting as well. So talk to me a little bit
For
about
sure.
like when you're talking to say new parents who are, getting ready to, maybe they had the kids now potty trained, walking, starting to talk, and they're kind of realizing there's a lot more to this than I thought. How do you kind of make that accessible to them in terms of holding out that vision of saying, because I think a lot of times what happens in the church and in Christian circles is people say something about like, yes, you should disciple your children, you should do that. And I think there's a little bit about what we're talking about right here. People hear that and go, okay, that sounds like I need to do something. What does that exactly mean practically? How do I start to kind of build that in as a discipline or as a constant practice?
Well, before getting well, I guess this is practical. I was going to say before getting to the practical part, but I think one of the important parts is that you are following Christ. And so your own disciplines, the practice of I'm I'm following Christ. I'm reading the Bible. I'm practicing these things and participating in the body, and my kids are watching that. I'm someone who prays. I'm someone who prays about stuff with my kids, and I'm someone who talks to people about Jesus or whatever. So really, I can't skip that. I think then a lot of discipleship is happening as they become conscious, right? Because they're watching you. Oh, that's what it looks like to follow Jesus. We're having these conversations. That's really helpful. But then the intentional part, of course, is having scripture and worship and prayer as a part of your family life. That somehow in your traditions and in your rhythms, that's something that's important because Jesus is who we're following and he's the center of our home. And so we're reading together, we're praying together, we're singing together. So that can look like a daily family worship. Could be, oh, we read the scripture for breakfast in the morning, or, of course that could be super. And so that's the beginning point, of course, but you kind of started me with, okay, they're young, but there definitely is some important transitions that take place as they get into, okay, they're middle school, they're getting into high school. Well, that's going to start looking pretty different. And I'd say the one-on-one relationships and the one-on-one discussions more important at that point, as well as some other things.
Well, talk to me a little bit about this one-on-one discussions because I agree with you. I think the way we've characterized it is like you go from being a benevolent dictator, which ends when you can't physically move the child around, like pick them up, and then you go to coach, which is I can make you run laps and do push-ups, but I can't play the game for you. And then you're moving into mentor, which is I want to be here for you, but you have to kind of choose this relationship. And so somewhere in that coaching to mentoring position is that a lot of those one-on-one conversations. And so tell me a little bit about what that looks like in your life and how that plays out. For me, it means a lot of miles walking around a hayfield beside our house, talking to my kids. But what does that look like in your practice?
Well, if I could reemphasize what you just said too, before answering the question, and that is that they have to choose that. There's that moment where you give the invitation and say, you know what, I'm supposed to be your coach. And yeah, there's some stuff I can make you do, but mostly what we need to do now is going to have to be that you're playing, you're a part of this, and this is what you want from me. I think that's really important. I think those conversations take place. That's a part of the transitional. We're having different discussions about issues, and I guess this starts into the other part of your question, which is, of course, you want to take advantage of when stuff happens, right? They're they have a thought they haven't had, they have a question, they have a relationship that went bad, they have a failure, or, you know, they have a theological doubt, all of that, of course, that's the great stuff for discipleship, because then it just brings everything to the surface and you're like, okay, let's talk about this. What does this look like from a biblical perspective? Let's pray about this. Let's, get into it. So, and some of those times come up where they're in the crossroads. And I would say some parents miss the difficult middle school years where, and that's, 11, 12, 13, whatever, where sometimes they need discipline and sometimes they need discipleship. And I really like giving them the opportunity to make the choice, to say, okay, so which way do you want to go here? Are we gonna be like, this is what's gonna happen? I'm the parent. Or would you like to talk through this and I have some advice and you can have some decision making thing if you want to follow Jesus, and I'm going to give you some space to make some decisions and work this out and figure out what's going to work for you. So, and I think like you, it's just alone time. You have to get alone. Maybe at night they seem to be a little more chatty, right? Or when they have a big problem, then hopefully they're coming and saying, "Okay, Dad, this is what's going on. What am I supposed to do?"
Yeah, I joke with my wife that nobody ever warms up and is really ready for a parental conversation anymore in my house until sometime after 10:30 and generally after 11. And there's, honestly, a kind of internal struggle for me whether I should jump into bed at 10
Yeah.
or if I want to stay up and actually participate in that, because that is the essential part. I mean, that's where the parenting rubber really hits the road. I like this idea of discipling in terms of just thinking from that phrase to Matthew, because discipling implies a walking with, and a walking with implies we'll be in the rain together and we'll occasionally get lost together. Meaning that I think for parents to hear this, and maybe even especially new parents or parents of teens, that this isn't about being right all the time. It's about being present. And I don't know about all the time, but as much of the time as possible. In other words, that I may not know all the answers. I may not have everything figured out, but I will walk with you through this
Mhm.
and I will lend you the perspective. And just by nature of the fact that I've been here longer, I do have some perspective to
Yeah.
offer. I think that that's kind of an important that there's an element of would you say there's an element of endurance in discipleship? I think that seems like that's an important piece of it.
Yeah, that's right. Because it goes on and on and on.
Right.
They keep calling and they keep texting, and there's a new there's a new phase. I really like what you said about not having all the answers. Just to touch on that point real quick, which is my job ultimately is to help them follow Christ, not to tell them what it means to
Yeah.
specifically follow Christ in every situation. And so if we're not giving them the tools to seek and discern God's will in a certain situation, it's really tempting to say, well, obviously this is what you should do. Um, Instead, a lot of times when I know, or when I think I know what that is, I say, well, what do you think you should do? Have you prayed about this? What scriptures do you think are relevant? Is there any other counsel that you think maybe you should seek out? Have you thought through the pros and the cons? And I go through kind of the process of how do we discern God's will? How does he speak to us? And then they have to do the work. And of course, as a parent, I'm a part of that process, but I'm not the final word on that process. And so, but my job is also to help them go through the process. So they'll come back to me and say, well, I've thought through all this stuff. Here's what I'm coming up with. What do you think? And then we can talk more deeply about it.
Well, I think that's really striking in the sense that the heart of what you just said there is about questions. And I think that there's an incorrect perception that the heart of parenting is about answers. Parents, so I know what's best here.
Mhm.
And there is an aspect, I have a 2-year-old in the house right now, and yeah, I'm pretty certain that in the vast majority of circumstances, I know what's best for the 2-year-old. But I also have a 17-year-old house, and there's less circumstances where I feel like I know all the answers. And this particular 17-year-old is now a very active EMT, and so there's a whole lot of circumstances. If we stop in a car accident, I'm not the one that has the senior authority on what's going on there. There's now
Mhm.
aspects that this person who's a lot younger than me has a lot more experience than I do in these certain areas. So I love that kind of, you know, discipleship implies a level of asking questions. From your perspective, was there a time where you kind of felt like there was that switch where like there's a certain age where you go from like kind of, hey, I know this into I need to move primarily into a coaching mindset here or more of a question asking mindset?
Well, I would say I have made the mistake of looking back of doing that later than I should have. I remember some of my older kids, I was giving answers all the time. It was later I realized, like it says in Hebrews about that someone grows their ability to discern what is right and wrong by doing it. I mean, there's this process of developing convictions, and I actually saw some of my older ones kind of suffer from not having their own convictions because I was giving them all the answers and they're like, well, that's good enough for me. And then it's like, well, that's not actually good enough for you because it's not going to last you your life. And so I'm saying I'm pushing that down for younger, like, so right now, the one that I'm really focusing on is my 12-year-old who's just kind of waking up, you know, he's like, whoa, he's thinking, he's seeing, he's having social interactions, and he's feeling pressure and he has desires and there's all this stuff. And so this is a good time to go ahead and say, what do you think is the right thing to do, and start sooner than later, probably. And then, of course, early on, maybe you're a little more often you say, well, those are some good ideas, but no, that's not what you should do.
But not the best ideas. They're
Yeah.
good
So
ideas,
let
but not the
me
best ideas.
let me give you some more options. What do you think about this?
Let me supplement a little bit to the thinking that you're going through. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I've heard quite a few parents like talk about like trying to find that transition point of not just like telling them, "Hey, this is what you should do in this situation," but kind of like letting them figure it out on their own. And it always seems like, at least at first, I've heard from a lot of parents who are looking back on that and have said like, at first it's really tricky because like there's kind of this fear in the back of your head of just like, well, if I like just kind of this protection mindset of if I don't tell them what the right thing is to do, then they're going to end up getting hurt. And so I guess I'd just be curious to hear from you, like how have you been able to like work through that and push past that to ultimately do what is going to ultimately be beneficial for your kids' growth?
Yeah, that's a great question because it opens up the fact that you, as the parent, are doing some risk analysis.
Hmm.
And so there are probably most things that you would say, you know what? If he screws that up, it doesn't really matter. And he's probably going to learn a lot. And so you give them space when it kind of doesn't matter. It's like they're not going to really get hurt in this situation. So give them space. As someone who homeschools his kids, one of the areas that we do is just kind of self-management. At some point you're like, okay, well, you have work to do. I'm going to let you figure out how to manage yourself. I'm not going to tell you your schedule, and so, and if they don't do it, right, then they realize the consequences of that. Well, I guess you're not going over to your friend's house or whatever because you didn't finish it, just that kind of thing. Well, that's no big deal. That helps them. Failure helps them. So that's a good point. But then there's some stuff like, okay, you know, your teenager finally gets a phone and you're trying to figure out what they're going to have on it or what kind of access they're going to have, and you're processing all that. And you don't say, well, I hope you figure that out. You know, you say, well, pornography or whatever else you might get into, we're not going to let that be an option. Like, this is going to be totally locked down. So, like, we're going to talk about it, but I'm not going to give you a chance to let's just screw that up, right? This is an example of something that's very serious and very harmful that isn't really an optional thing.
I think that that early interaction, the questions, it does two things I think are really interesting. First of all, it puts you in a position of not having to know everything, and also puts you in a position of getting to know your child better. So, if you've trained yourself early to ask those questions, then you're going to discover a lot more. It also trains your child to do exactly what you said, Matthew, which is to be kind of self driving, self actuated, to be able to make some of their own decisions. And I think the thing that is also exciting is that it enables abilities that will often surprise you. At least it has in my children. I mean, there are so many places that my kids have excelled at that I didn't see coming. And so to go back to that analogy of being the coach, you can coach them, you can prepare them, you can decide if they're ready to go on the field, but you can't play for them. And so sometimes they're going to go out and get tackled for a loss, and you're going to feel bad for them. And other times they're going to just set the place on fire, and you're going to be like, whoa, where did that come from? That was more than I could have ever done. I never threw a pass like that in my life. And I've never been able to run around like
Yeah.
that. And then to be able to watch that, that's the thrill of parenting that I think often we talk so much about the struggle and the pain and the hurt and the hard and all that kind of things. But Matthew, as we've roomed together at some of these retreats, we've had long conversations. And I know that while that's certainly present and none of us are perfect and we all make mistakes as parents, you alluded to you wish you'd start early with some of your kids. And I just had a massive parenting fail with one of my younger ones last week that still honestly is stinging pretty bad because it was a total screw up on my part. And I just saw the damage that happened and I realized the mistake. And I'm still mourning my idiocy and having gotten to the point where I had and a matter of neglect had caused a problem that could have been fixed if I paid attention. So we have those things, but I know that you've got a lot of fun stories. So just for a second, let's flip the table a little bit here. And, after you disciple kids and you're at the other end, you're at the position where you have older children, I know older boys especially, that you have a pretty sweet relationship with. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. And once again, if I can, before I do, I think you made a great point because as I look back on my parenting, I would say similarly, one of the most grieving mistakes has been neglect, has been I'm assuming too much because of what I see on the surface. And I think, oh, I'll see if there's something wrong. No, you won't. And I've seen things come out later and I'm like, oh my goodness, that was happening. And I thought we are good, and so don't assume and don't, and there's a neglect there. So anyway, I think that's a really good observation of yours. And so, yeah, having adult kids is so fun, isn't it? I mean, these
It is,
guys,
it is really a thrill. So-
it is. And when these guys are following the Lord and they have great questions, and it's just a joy just to have coffee with them, and just to be real, have real conversations. And it's like, and I love to, as you know, Jonathan, I love to sit around and let's do philosophy and theology and let's just talk about stuff. Well, they love that. And so we just go there and have a great time. And I think right now, especially with my older ones who are not in my home, my policy is unless I'm like in an interview like this, if there's a phone call or a text, it gets answered immediately. I answer that phone. Uh, I want them to know that I am there at the moment, and maybe I go extreme for that, but I don't think I'll ever regret that, you know, at the end. And so the fact that they keep calling and keep texting is a joy also. I would say one other thing, you mentioned my sons, but I have a daughter who's a freshman in college now. And she's really blown me away in the last couple of years by telling me, and she tells other people, that I am like literally, as they love to say, literally her best friend. And, I think I don't deserve that, but she I'm the only one who knows the most or everything, you know. I'm the one that she feels like she can talk to, who's always going to be there. And of course, to have that, to have your kids say, you know, dad's my best friend. Well, that's yeah, it doesn't get better, But now she likes this boy. And I'm like, oh my goodness, he's going to take her away. This is terrible. I can't be her best friend forever.
You, I have to say, you said that, and I was thinking to myself, that's going to sting.
Oh man. Oh, it's terrible.
So, so I was being sympathetic before you even got to that point, thinking that,
Yeah. Oh, it's coming.
I have, there, it is a real thing that you get to a point and you're like, no, honestly, I think you probably have to stay single because there isn't possibly anybody who will ever meet
That's
up to
right.
the requirements. But I think you've talked a little bit about this. There's definitely a dad screening that goes on, but my daughters are kind of like, well, yeah, but they also have to come to the brothers. And if they can't get to the brothers, then it's not worth it. And
Yeah.
that gives me some extra satisfaction. And honestly, it's been kind of fun to watch a few try to go through the brothers and be like, yeah, you're not gonna make it. So
I was going to say, knowing all of those brothers, that's quite the gauntlet of brothers to go through. So
that's right.
It's a good filtration.
So I don't know if we have time for this, but just to tell you very quickly, this daughter, who's a freshman, the particular boy has been pursuing her, and he found out through the various discussions of getting to know her among friends and stuff that if anybody's interested, gatekeeper number one is Josiah. He's the younger brother, and so he had lunch with him and talked to him before he ever talked to her. But then there's gatekeeper number two, which is Caleb, and he's much more intimidating and a little bigger, and so Josiah passed this guy on to Caleb, and so they're taking their job so seriously. I'm just laughing and loving it at the same time. And so finally Caleb said, okay, I'm gonna give you dad's number. He called me the final boss. It's just so funny. It was great. But it worked, and Hannah, my daughter, she loves it. She's like, yeah, bring it on. Like, if they can't get through that, forget it. I'm not interested.
Well, I mean, the boy's got courage. You got to, I mean, like,
He does.
that takes both some maturity and some courage to walk through
right.
there. So
if you don't have the maturity and the courage and the determination to do that, then you're canceled anyway.
yeah, that is I'm torn between cheering for your sons and your daughter and your situation, be like, that's great. And also, as somebody who had to approach a dad one time and go through a brother, feeling some sympathy for the young man. Like,
For sure.
I remember a late night conversation with my wife's brother when we were in college, when everybody had gone to bed and there's a pause and he's like, so your intentions for my sister, what exactly? And he was younger than I was, but also bigger than I was. And I was like, oh, we're to the point that we're going to have to come clean on this and be sure to be clear. And so, yeah, and he is one of my best friends at this point. So that went well, but I do have some memory of that trepidation and to have some sympathy for Hannah's pursuer here. So thank you, Matthew. I appreciate that. I appreciate you kind of putting some wheels on that. Cause I think, like I said, often we do talk about the struggles and we don't want to make light of that. There are struggles in parenting, and certainly there's nothing out there that can quite break your heart like parenting can in some ways. But if you're willing to put in the discipleship, and I think that's a very apt word, if you're willing to walk with somebody, if you're willing to endure and to hang in there, I think that what gets undersold is the other end. And I'm a little bit shorter on the road than you are, but have some adult children, can absolutely attest to the sweetness of that relationship.
Yeah.
And that, there's still challenges. There's still things you have to do there. And yet I find myself grinning with a silly grin on my face a lot more than I find myself with tears rolling down my cheeks in terms of that relationship. So Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to come and share your wisdom and your perspective. Dave, I think Dr. McDill is the first PhD that we've had on the show. So I think, Matthew, you've given us
we have I think we had one other. I think we did have one other.
Dr. Cohn, you're correct. Cindy doesn't lead with it. And so I also got kind of trapped by that. You're right. So Cindy, if you're listening, I apologize. But still, Matthew, you've doubled the amount of PhDs that we've had on the show. So you've definitely brought a lot of prestige to the Be Unbound podcast, as well as your wisdom and experience. So
I hate to bring it up, but Dr.
that.
Smith, Dr. Roger Smith.
Oh, you know what? Never mind, Matthew. You're doing good, but you're in good company.
But Roger's an MD. He's not a PhD.
Yeah, that's right. That's a PhD.
Oh, that's
anyway,
true.
Totally different. So regardless, thank you so much for your time and for sharing all that you have with us. And we really appreciate your time today.
It's been great. Thanks.
All right, David, I can't count PhDs and people that have advanced degrees. So apologies to all previous guests who I discounted with my flippant comment there. That'll teach me. David stayed upright and conscious throughout our entire interview. And so we appreciate that, David. And once again, Matthew had some really interesting perspective, some conversation, and honestly shared some stories that put some wheels underneath the discipleship models and thinking there, and kind of back to what we said, which is there's a practical aspect that can't be denied in terms of Matthew's experience tempered with reality. So
Yeah, yeah. I think we've done several podcast episodes where we've talked with people just about the challenges of parenting and transitioning with teenage and adult children. And I think a theme that's been constant throughout, but something that I think Matthew brought out really well, was that you don't have to do everything completely right. The most important thing is just being present and showing up and having your kids like be confident in the fact that you want to be there for them, and that whenever they want to like have your insight and your guidance, that you're going to be available for them. And I think that's really refreshing, in that I think it just like thinking about parenting, that just takes a lot of pressure off of your shoulders, that like, hey, I can like, it is obviously like a good thing for me to try to do the right thing as much as possible, but at the end of the day, if the most important thing is just for me to be there for them, and the fact knowing that God is going to take care of the rest.
yeah, that discipleship aspect, which is it's an endurance game, it's a long-term game, it's a game of staying in, and it's a game where you're going to make mistakes, and that we've talked about this before in other episodes, and I just kind of want to revisit it and hit it again and again, because I think it is so important. There are certainly things you can do to your children that will mess them up in a very large way. There are some sins and some errors we can make that are horrible, and we're not talking about those. But then there's these other errors that we make that don't rise to that level of catastrophe, but really do damage, and it's cumulative damage. And you can approach that two ways. The one is to carry a ton of guilt about that and just always feel like you've ruined your child. And then the other is to say, well, it's done, and I can't do anything about it. And both of those are wrong in different directions. So often, the answer to that is you have to see it, you have to acknowledge it, you have to apologize, and you have to do something different. And that's not super complicated, but often it's super hard. And I alluded to this in our conversation with Matthew, but I just recently had what I would characterize as a pretty colossal parenting failure. And at the heart of it, it was a child that has just been overlooked. And that doesn't really matter what reasons there are for that. Kind of did know it was happening as it was happening. And there was this moment where we were walking in that hayfield, and it basically came up. And the answer was, yeah, I do kind of feel forgotten. That's a big deal. I mean, like, if there's one thing I'm supposed to do as a parent, is to make sure they know that they are loved beyond anything else. And when you have a kid that is willing to admit and say, I feel like I've forgotten and overlooked, that's not like we had a bad day. That's a pattern of failure that has built up. And, short of driving a spear through my body, I just don't know anything that was more painful than hearing those. And it wasn't just hearing it, it was seeing it and understanding as those words were spoken, they were utterly true. They were true in terms of the way that child felt. And it was true in terms of like, yeah, this is an absolute failure on my part. I know exactly what this person is talking about. And I literally collapsed to my knees and grabbed that kid in my arms and said, I am so sorry. Like, doesn't matter. And, in my head, I had 13 excuses for why this happened. And some of them were real in the fact that is part of the reason it happened, but they're not adequate. I mean, it doesn't matter what the cause was. The result was not proportional. Right. And then, the next thing was to come back and hit my knees and say, dear God, forgive me and help me to do better. And that's a daily prayer now. And it's a daily reassessment, and it doesn't get fixed in a day. I mean, there's a pattern here that has to be erased by a new pattern. And that's hard work. And it's added to things that I've got to do in a day and all those things. And yet do that right. And God gives these ways to redeem pain that often can heal more than was actually there. In other words, you can get better than you were before because you have this relationship that has not come through a trial. And, we're still in the process of that. But, if you're a parent listening to this, or if you're going to be a parent, unfortunately, you're going to face similar situations. I mean, that's just the nature of the fact that we are are people that fail. And when that happens, the formula for coming back is not difficult. It's understanding it, it's asking for forgiveness, and it's doing something different. But it sometimes is hard. But I hope listening to Matthew, you heard the other end of it, which is, that fun, fantastic relationship you have with adult kids who still care about your opinions, who still seek out your mentorship, but yet then bring so much to the table themselves, new skills, new abilities, new friendships, new relationships, new fun and new excitement, and new adventure that wasn't there before and would not have been there but for them. And that part of parenting is equally as real, and one that I hope people understand as well, that all that work and effort and apologies and humility comes out with a pretty awesome result. So, well, David, I'm tempted to let you do the pitch, but I think maybe I'd like to preserve you because we have some more recordings that we're doing today for this podcast. And
My voice thanks you.
So we like David so much, we want to keep him around, and his voice, the famous voice, at least one of them good on this podcast. And so this is the time of year that if you're listening to this, we're really serious about telling you about Unbound, because this is a time where lots of our folks are enrolling for this upcoming fall class. So this is the spring, through the spring and summer, we're going to have a lot of people enrolling in the program and getting ready for the fall. So a reminder of our programs at this point, the three programs that we really want to tell you about is Equip. It's our program for homeschooled high school students, coaching program that helps you actualize and use your education. It works with any curriculum. Declare, which is our homeschool high school coaching program that works specifically with the My Father's World high school curriculum. And then our Ascend program, which is a either dual enrollment while you're in high school or post-high school college replacement or college preparatory program. And not saying all those things like maybe. I'm saying that it does all of those things. And if you're interested in that kind of future for yourself, if you're listening to this, or for your child, now's the time to check out our website at beunbound.us, and even better, schedule a call with one of our admissions folks who can walk you through how that works. Now, what I thought I'd do today is I'll just finish this up by talking about what happens when you have an admissions call. And I want to really stress to you that we use that term admissions consulting call really seriously. This isn't a sales call. It can be, in the sense that if you end up being interested in our program, our team can help you enroll. And that is obviously going to involve you exchanging some money for the chance to enroll in our programs. And so we're not being coy about that. But we want you to know up front that our primary interest is figuring out what it is that you want to do, what it is your student wants to do, and then understanding whether we can help with that or not. And if we can help with that, the primary job is to explain to you how that would work. Then we're interested in enrolling you. And that is helpful. I know that I'm a little bit leery of, walking into a motorcycle dealership and talking to the guy about the motorcycle, because I'm like, oh, this guy's going to try to sell me on something, or trying to hire somebody for services and be like, got a little bit of standoffish here. Like, I want to know about this, but I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I just want to tell you straight up, you can call us and just say, I don't know what this is, tell me. Or you can say, I've been looking at this for a long time, and I think this is the right thing. You could call us and say, we're ready to sign up. And the results in all three of those is going to be the same, which is our admissions team is going to say, tell me what it is that you want. Tell me about your student. Tell me about who you are if you're the student. Tell me what it is that you want to do. And then let me listen to that. And then if that is something we can help you with, let me explain how that works. If it's something we can't help you with, let me explain that as well. And maybe we can brainstorm together and we can put you on a track that involves something besides Unbound. So if you are interested in any of those programs and you'd like more information, but you're a little scared about talking to a live person because you might be a sales call, let me assure you that that's not the way it works. And let me just put it on the line here and say, if that is the thing that happened, you think that happened, get in touch with us, call me directly, and we'll have a conversation. We'll make that right. But get in touch with us. We'd love to talk to you. Would love to hear about your student. Would love to hear about what it is that you want to do next. And if we can help, would love to tell you how we could help you do that. We are getting ready as we record this to attend Capstone, which is a final live event for our kind of academic year. Of course, Apex kicks us off then in August. And so we'll be flying out to Colorado for that. We're looking forward to it. And David, this is a fun but bittersweet event. It's fun always because it's with Unbound students. It's bittersweet because it's sweet to see our students who we now know really well after spending a year and in some cases multiple years with. But it's bittersweet because it is our last live event for this year's class. And so that's coming up and we're looking forward to it. And I would be delighted to be looking forward to welcoming you to the community in the future. And if you're interested in that, check out beunbound.us, schedule a call, and talk to our team. Until next time, be unbound.